At my father's funeral, they told me to sit down and stay quiet. My stepmother stood at the podium with tears she'd practiced in the mirror, while my stepbrother adjusted his Rolex and my stepsister checked her phone. The church was packed with Boston's elite, 400 people who came to mourn Richard Palmer, the man who built an empire from nothing. But when I tried to speak, to say goodbye to the only parent I'd ever known, Victoria's hand shot up like a traffic cop. "Security will escort you out if you cause a scene," she hissed. So I sat there silent, watching strangers eulogize a man they barely knew. Then the lawyer stood up. And when he read those words, when he announced that I, the daughter they tried to erase, was now CEO of Palmer Industries, $800 million of steel and innovation, the sanctuary went dead silent. That's when I smiled. Because sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Palmer, and the morning of my father's funeral, Boston woke up under a sky the color of slate. The kind of gray that settles into your bones and makes you forget the sun ever existed. I stood in front of my apartment mirror in South End, trying to zip up the black dress I'd bought 3 days earlier when the call came. "Your father passed away during the night. Please come to the estate to discuss arrangements." Not an invitation. A summons. The fabric caught on the zipper, and I yanked it so hard the seam split. Perfect. Even my grief couldn't fit into the boxes they wanted. I'd spent the last 6 years building websites for small businesses, living in a studio apartment with radiators that clanged through winter nights, eating takeout over my laptop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My father had offered to help 1,000 times, wanted to bring me into Palmer Industries, give me an office with a view of the harbor. But Victoria made sure I knew I wasn't really family. Not the way Brandon and Lindsay were family. They had her blood. I just had his name. The drive to Newton took 40 minutes through morning traffic. The Palmer estate sat on 3 acres behind iron gates that opened with a code I no longer remembered. I had to press the intercom like a stranger. The house was a Georgian colonial, white columns and black shutters, the kind of place that appeared in architecture magazines under the heading New England Elegance. My mother died giving birth to me in this house, in the master bedroom upstairs, before my father met Victoria at some charity gala 2 years later. By the time I was 4, she'd moved in with her 2 teenagers, and I became the odd piece in someone else's puzzle. Victoria answered the door herself, which surprised me. She usually had staff for that. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her black suit sharp enough to cut glass. "Jessica," she said, "not warmth, not coldness, just my name like a fact. We're gathering in the library." I stepped inside and the smell hit me immediately. My father's cologne, cedar and bergamot, still lingering in the hallway. For a second I forgot how to breathe. The library was exactly as I remembered. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a mahogany desk the size of a boat, leather chairs arranged around a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. Brandon sat in one chair, his jaw tight, scrolling through his phone. He worked in finance, something vague with hedge funds that he never explained and I never asked about. Lindsay perched on the arm of the sofa, her red nails tapping against her wine glass even though it was 9 in the morning. She ran a lifestyle blog, posted pictures of green juices and sunset yoga. 30,000 followers who thought her life was aspirational. They both looked up when I walked in. Brandon nodded once. Lindsay said, "Oh, you came," like she'd been hoping I wouldn't. Victoria gestured to an empty chair. "Sit. We have arrangements to finalize." I sat. The lawyer, Thomas Garrett, stood near the window, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that looked older than me. He'd been my father's attorney for 20 years, handled everything from corporate mergers to the prenup Victoria signed. Victoria cleared her throat. "As you all know, Richard's service is tomorrow at St. Catherine's Cathedral. We've prepared remarks. Brandon will speak about his business legacy. Lindsay will share a personal memory. I'll close with a tribute to his character." She didn't look at me when she said it, just continued as if I weren't there. "The reception will be at the Boston Harbor Hotel. We've limited it to close friends and business associates." I waited for her to mention my name. She didn't. Finally I said, "And what about me?" She blinked slowly, the way you might look at a child who's asked why the sky is blue. "Jessica, I think it's best if you simply attend as a guest. This is a delicate time. The press will be there. We need to present a unified family front. Unified, I repeated. She nodded. Brandon and Lindsay are prepared. You've been well absent from the business. People might not understand your presence at the podium. Absent. The word hung in the air like smoke. I've been absent because every time I came to family dinners, Lindsay made jokes about my thrift store clothes. Because Brandon asked me when I was going to get a real job. Because Victoria seated me at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen, where I could hear the staff whisper about the sad daughter who didn't belong. I wasn't absent. I was exiled. Thomas Garrett shifted his weight, his leather briefcase creaking. Mrs. Palmer, perhaps we should discuss Richard's wishes regarding the service. Victoria's smile went sharp. I'm his wife. I know his wishes. He would want dignity. He would want respect. Not, she paused, looking directly at me now, sentiment. My chest tightened. I wanted to argue, to tell her that my father had called me 2 weeks before he died, said we needed to talk about something important, asked me to come to dinner. But I'd been finishing a project, told him I'd come next week. Next week never came. I stood up. Fine. I'll sit quietly. Like always. I turned toward the door, but Thomas cleared his throat. Miss Palmer, if I may. There is one matter we need to address before the service. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope. Your father left specific instructions regarding the reading of his will. It's to take place immediately following the funeral, at the reception. All beneficiaries must be present. Victoria's face didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Of course. We'll all be there. I left the estate and sat in my car for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying not to scream. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Your father wanted you to have this. I'm sorry for your loss. Attached was a photo. My father, maybe 6 months ago, standing in front of Palmer Industries Tower, the sun setting behind him. He looked tired. Older than I remembered. But he was smiling. I zoomed in on his face, searching for some kind of message, some explanation for why he'd let this happen. Why he'd let Victoria rewrite our story. The funeral was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. I drove home, changed into a different black dress, one without a broken zipper, and tried to eat something. The toast sat in my stomach like concrete. At 1:30, I drove to St. Catherine's Cathedral, a massive stone church in Back Bay with stained glass windows that fractured light into 1,000 colors. The parking lot was already full. News vans lined the street. Richard Palmer's death was news. Local boy made good, built a manufacturing empire, employed 3,000 people, donated millions to children's hospitals. The headline in the Globe that morning read, Boston loses a titan. I walked through the heavy oak doors into the vestibule. Soft organ music drifted from inside. People milled around in clusters, black suits and dresses, voices low and respectful. I recognized faces. Board members from Palmer Industries. Investors. Politicians. The mayor was there, shaking hands near the guest book. I signed my name, Jessica Palmer, my handwriting shaky, and a woman I didn't know glanced at the book, then at me, her eyebrows raising slightly before she looked away. Inside, the sanctuary stretched vast and solemn. Rows of wooden pews faced an altar draped in white lilies. My father's casket sat at the front, closed, polished mahogany with silver handles. I felt my knees weaken. Victoria stood near the front pew, greeting guests, her face a mask of composed grief. Brandon and Lindsay flanked her like sentries. When Victoria saw me, she leaned toward an usher, whispered something, and he approached me with an apologetic smile. Miss Palmer, you'll be seated in the 3rd row. Family is in the first 2. 3rd row. Behind business associates. Behind people who'd met my father at cocktail parties. I nodded, too numb to fight, and slid into the pew. The woman next to me introduced herself as someone from the company's legal team, offered her condolences, then turned back to her phone. The organ music swelled. People found their seats. The service began. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pastor spoke about my father's generosity, his vision, his commitment to excellence. He talked about a man I recognized but barely knew. Then Victoria walked to the podium. Her voice was steady, melodic, the voice of someone used to speaking at charity luncheons. Richard Palmer was a man of integrity, she began. He built not just a company but a legacy. He believed in family, in loyalty, in hard work. She went on for 10 minutes, painting a picture of a devoted husband, a loving father to Brandon and Lindsay, a pillar of the community. She never said my name. Brandon spoke next. Talked about business lessons, about my father teaching him to read financial statements, to negotiate with precision, to never show weakness. He thanked his mother for standing by their father's side. Lindsay followed, sharing a story about a family vacation to Martha's Vineyard, laughing through tears about my father's terrible golf swing. The congregation chuckled softly. It was warm, human, perfect. I sat frozen, my hands clenched in my lap. Every word felt like a stone added to a wall being built around my father's memory, shutting me out. When Lindsay finished, she walked back to her seat, and Victoria returned to the podium. Before we close, I want to thank everyone for coming. Richard would be so moved by this outpouring of love. Let us now proceed to the final hymn. That was it. No mention of me. No chance to speak. I'd been erased. As the congregation stood for the hymn, I stayed seated, staring at the casket. My father was in there and I hadn't said goodbye. I hadn't told him I was sorry for missing dinner. Hadn't told him I loved him. The music swelled around me, voices lifting in harmony, and I felt like I was drowning. Then, as the hymn ended, Thomas Garrett stood from his seat in the second row. He walked to the pastor, whispered something. The pastor nodded, looked uncertain but stepped aside. Thomas approached the podium. There is one final matter, he said, his voice cutting through the settling quiet. Richard Palmer left explicit instructions regarding this service. He wished for his daughter, Jessica Palmer, to have the opportunity to speak. The sanctuary went silent. Every head turned toward me. Victoria's face went white, then red. Thomas continued. Unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, Miss Palmer was not included in the formal program. However, I'm here to honor Richard's written wishes. He gestured toward me. Miss Palmer, if you'd like to say a few words. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt 400 pairs of eyes on me. Victoria's expression was murderous. Brandon looked like he wanted to disappear. But I stood. My legs shook as I walked down the aisle, past the mayor, past the board members, past Victoria, who hissed, "This is inappropriate," as I passed. I reached the podium, gripped its edges to steady myself. I looked out at the sea of faces. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some like Victoria's hostile. I took a breath. My name is Jessica Palmer, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. The microphone caught it, amplified it through the speakers. I'm Richard Palmer's daughter. Some of you know that. Some of you don't. I paused, swallowed hard. My father was complicated. He built an empire. He changed lives. He also, I think, struggled with how to balance the weight of what he'd created with the people he loved. I saw Thomas nod slightly encouragingly. I kept going. He called me 2 weeks before he died. Asked me to come to dinner. Said he had something important to tell me. I didn't go. I was busy. I thought I had time. My voice cracked. I don't know what he wanted to say, but I know he loved me. Even when I felt invisible, even when I wasn't included, even when I lived on the other side of the city in a world that didn't look anything like this, he loved me. And I loved him. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. Slowly others joined. Not everyone. Victoria didn't move. But enough people that the sound filled the cathedral, echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I stepped away from the podium, my face burning, and walked back to my seat. The pastor quickly moved to close the service. As people began filing out, I stayed in my pew, watching the casket being wheeled down the aisle toward the hearse outside. Victoria passed without looking at me. Brandon muttered, "Happy now?" Lindsay just shook her head. But as the crowd thinned, Marcus Webb appeared beside me. He was 50-something, silver hair, kind eyes, my father's CFO for 15 years. He extended his hand. "That took courage," he said quietly. "Your father would have been proud." I shook his hand, unsure what to say. He leaned closer. "Meet me at the reception. There are things you need to know." The reception was held at the Boston Harbor Hotel, a waterfront property with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark water. White tablecloths, catered food, open bar. People clustered in groups, talking in hushed tones that gradually grew louder as the alcohol flowed. I stood near the window holding a glass of wine I wasn't drinking, watching seagulls dive toward the waves outside. Marcus found me 20 minutes in. "Walk with me," he said. We stepped out onto a terrace overlooking the harbor. The wind was cold, biting through my dress. He pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket. "Your father asked me to give this to you. If anything happened to him." I stared at the folder. "What is it?" "Just read it. Before Thomas reads the will." He pressed it into my hands and walked back inside before I could ask anything else. I opened the folder. Inside were documents, financial statements, board meeting minutes, medical records, and a letter handwritten, my father's slanted script across lined paper. "My dearest Jess," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry. For so many things. For letting Victoria push you away. For not standing up when I should have. For building something so big I forgot what mattered most. But I'm fixing it now. Everything I built, everything I fought for, it's yours. Not because you're perfect. Not because you earned it by suffering. But because you're my daughter. And you're the only one I trust to carry it forward with integrity." My hands shook. I kept reading. "Victoria doesn't know yet. Neither do Brandon or Lindsay. Thomas will read the will after this reception, and they'll find out that Palmer Industries, all of it, goes to you. The CEO position. The controlling shares. The legacy. I know this will be hard. They'll fight you. But Marcus will help. Dr. Hoffman has evidence about what really happened to me. Trust them. Trust yourself. You're stronger than you know. I love you, Jess. Always have. Always will. Dad." I looked up, my vision blurred with tears. Through the window I could see Victoria laughing with the mayor, Brandon talking to investors, Lindsay posing for a photo with someone from the society pages. They had no idea. In 20 minutes, Thomas Garrett would stand up and read my father's will, and their entire world would shatter. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the folder and walked inside. The game had changed. And for the first time in my life I wasn't sitting in the third row anymore. The reception hall buzzed with the sound of clinking glasses and muted conversations, the kind of careful social ballet that happens when powerful people gather to mourn someone even more powerful. I stood near the dessert table, the folder Marcus gave me pressed against my side like a secret burning through my dress. My father's letter replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Everything I built is yours. The CEO position. The controlling shares. I watched Victoria work the room like a seasoned politician, touching arms, leaning in close to whisper condolences, her performance flawless. She had no idea that in minutes, the floor would drop out from under her designer heels. Thomas Garrett stood near the bar, checking his watch. Our eyes met across the room and he gave me the smallest nod. It was time. He moved to the front of the reception hall where a small podium had been set up, tapped the microphone twice. The sharp sound cut through the conversations. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The room quieted gradually, faces turning toward him with polite curiosity. As executor of Richard Palmer's estate, I need to conduct the formal reading of his last will and testament. Per his explicit instructions, this must be done today, with all beneficiaries and key stakeholders present. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but something changed in her posture, a subtle stiffening of her spine. She glided toward the front, Brandon and Lindsay following like ducklings. I stayed where I was, half hidden behind a group of board members. Thomas opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick document bound in navy blue. "This will was executed 6 months ago," he began, replacing the previous version from 2018. Richard Palmer was of sound mind and body when these instructions were recorded, witnessed by myself and 2 additional attorneys from our firm. 6 months ago. That would have been March. I tried to remember what was happening then. My father had called me, asked me to lunch, seemed distracted when we met at a cafe in Cambridge. He'd asked about my business, about my apartment, about whether I was happy. I thought he was just being nostalgic. Now I understood he'd been preparing. Thomas cleared his throat and began reading. "I, Richard Edmund Palmer, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. First, to my wife Victoria Palmer, I leave our primary residence in Newton, Massachusetts, along with a trust fund of $5 million to be distributed over 10 years. The room remained quiet, but I saw Victoria's jaw tighten. $5 million was nothing compared to what she'd expected. Thomas continued. To my stepson Brandon Palmer, I leave $2 million in my collection of vintage automobiles. To my stepdaughter Lindsay Palmer, I leave $2 million in the beach house in Cape Cod. Lindsay's face went pale. Brandon's hand curled into a fist at his side. $9 million total for the three of them. Palmer Industries was worth $800 million. The math wasn't hard. People in the room were starting to whisper, doing the same calculation. Thomas paused, took a breath, and I knew what was coming. To my daughter, Jessica Marie Palmer, I leave the following. Full ownership of Palmer Industries, including all assets, properties, patents, and subsidiaries. All controlling shares of company stock, currently valued at $640 million. The CEO position, effective immediately upon my death. All remaining personal assets, including investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights. The room exploded. Not with cheers or applause, but with a collective gasp that sounded like air being sucked out of the space. Victoria's face went from pale to crimson in seconds. Brandon shouted, "That's impossible." Lindsay grabbed her mother's arm as if to steady herself. The board members near me turned to stare, their expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been respect. Thomas raised his voice over the chaos. Additionally, Richard appointed Marcus Webb as interim COO to assist with the transition, and established a trust to support Ms. Palmer's leadership development. These decisions are final, legally binding, and were made with full awareness of their implications. Victoria pushed through the crowd toward Thomas, her composure shattered. This is a mistake. Richard would never cut out his family like this. He wouldn't leave everything to someone who hasn't set foot in that company. Thomas met her gaze evenly. Mrs. Palmer, your husband was very clear about his intentions. He believed Jessica possessed the integrity and vision necessary to lead Palmer Industries into its next chapter. I have his recorded testimony if you'd like to review it. Recorded testimony. My father had videotaped his reasoning, made sure there would be no ambiguity, no way to claim he'd been confused or coerced. Brandon stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. She doesn't know anything about running a company. She makes websites for coffee shops. This is insane. Before I could respond, Marcus Webb appeared beside me. His voice carried across the room, calm and authoritative. Jessica Palmer has a degree in business administration from Boston University and has successfully run her own company for 6 years. Richard discussed his succession plan with me extensively. He believed she had exactly what Palmer Industries needed. Fresh perspective, ethical grounding, and genuine care for the people behind the profits. I felt dizzy. Everyone was staring at me now. The mayor looked confused. Investors were pulling out their phones, probably texting their analysts. Board members huddled together, whispering frantically. And my father's family, the people who treated me like an inconvenient ghost for years, looked at me with pure hatred. Victoria's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. We'll contest this. She pointed at Thomas. You'll hear from our attorneys by morning. Thomas snapped his briefcase shut. That is your right, Mrs. Palmer. However, I should mention that Richard anticipated this possibility. He included a clause stating that any beneficiary who contests the will forfeits their inheritance entirely. Those funds would then be donated to charity. Silence. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. She'd just been checkmated. Contest the will and lose even the $5 million she'd been left. Accept it and watch me take everything she thought was hers. Lindsay started crying, loud gasping sobs that drew uncomfortable looks. Brandon grabbed his mother's arm. We need to leave. Now. They pushed through the crowd toward the exit, Lindsay stumbling in her heels, mascara running down her face. The door slammed behind them hard enough to rattle the windows. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. I turned to see Dr. Rachel Hoffman, my father's physician, standing near the bar. She was in her late 50s, silver hair cut short, wearing a simple black suit. Others joined her applause, slowly at first, then building. Not everyone. Some board members looked furious. Some investors looked calculating, probably wondering if their money was safe. But enough people clapped that I felt something shift in the room. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Maybe even respect. Thomas approached me, his expression unreadable. Miss Palmer, we need to discuss next steps. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Marcus appeared at my other side. I'll drive you home. You shouldn't be alone right now. Dr. Hoffman joined us. I think we all need to talk. There are things about your father's death that you should know. Her words sent ice through my veins. What things? Not here, she said quietly, glancing around at the crowd that was slowly dispersing. Tomorrow. But Jessica, your father didn't die of a heart attack. At least not a natural one. I stared at her. What are you talking about? She touched my arm gently. Tomorrow. I promise I'll explain everything. But tonight, go home. Process this. Your life just changed in ways you can't yet comprehend. She was right. I let Marcus guide me out of the hotel, past clusters of people who watched me leave with expressions I couldn't read. Outside, the harbor wind cut through my dress. Marcus's car was parked in the executive lot, a sensible gray sedan that smelled like leather and coffee. We drove in silence through downtown Boston, past the financial district where Palmer Industries Tower rose 40 stories above the street, its windows reflecting the sunset in shades of gold and orange. That's yours now, Marcus said quietly. All of it. The building, the patents, the 3,000 employees counting on their paychecks. The contracts worth hundreds of millions. The responsibility. I pressed my forehead against the cool window. I don't know if I can do this. You can, he said. Your father believed you could. More importantly, I believe you can. Why? I turned to look at him. You barely know me. He smiled slightly. I've known you since you were 12 years old. Your father talked about you constantly. Showed me your school projects, your college essays, your business plan when you started your company. He was so proud of you, Jess. He just didn't know how to show it in a way that didn't make Victoria furious. So he showed it in the only way he knew how. He gave you everything. We pulled up outside my apartment building in the South End, a converted brownstone with creaky stairs and radiators that clanged. Marcus put the car in park. Get some rest. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, Thomas's office. We'll go through everything. The transition process, the board meeting scheduled for next week, the media strategy. You're going to need a team. I climbed out of the car, my legs weak. Thank you, Marcus, for believing in me. He leaned across the passenger seat. Your father was my best friend for 20 years. I'm not going to let his legacy fall apart. And I'm not going to let them destroy you. He drove away and I stood on the sidewalk watching his taillights disappear around the corner. Then I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped into my tiny studio with its thrift store furniture and walls covered in design sketches. Everything looked exactly the same. My laptop sat open on the desk where I'd left it that morning. My coffee mug from yesterday sat in the sink. The spider plant in the corner drooped slightly, needing water. But I wasn't the same person who'd left here 12 hours ago. That Jessica Palmer had been a web designer scraping by on small contracts, invisible to everyone who mattered. This Jessica Palmer was the CEO of an $800 million company, the most powerful woman in Boston manufacturing, and the target of a family's rage. I dropped the folder Marcus had given me on the bed and pulled out my father's letter again. Read it 3 times, searching for hidden meanings, for guidance, for some explanation of why he'd done this. The financial documents showed steady profits, strong contracts with aerospace and medical device companies, a healthy balance sheet. The board meeting minutes from the past year revealed tension, references to strategic disagreements between my father and certain board members, notes about a proposed merger that my father had blocked, concerns about quality control being sacrificed for profit margins. Then I found the medical records. My father had been seeing Dr. Hoffman regularly for the past 8 months. Blood tests showing elevated levels of certain toxins. Notes about symptoms that didn't match his supposed heart condition. Recommendations for further testing that had never been completed. The final entry was dated 3 days before he died. Patient reports increasing chest pain and difficulty breathing. Symptoms inconsistent with previous cardiac history. Recommended immediate hospitalization. Patient refused, stating he had important business to complete first. Important business. Changing his will. Making sure I would inherit everything before whatever was happening to him finished the job. I sat on the edge of my bed. The medical records spread around me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Dr. Hoffman's words echoed in my mind. Your father didn't die of a heart attack. Not a natural one. Which meant what? That someone had caused it? That his death wasn't the tragic but expected end of a man who'd worked too hard for too many years? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Congratulations, CEO. You just made some very powerful enemies. Sleep well. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Another text followed immediately. From Marcus this time. Don't respond to any messages from unknown numbers. Forward them to me immediately. They're trying to intimidate you. It's working, I typed back. Good, he replied. Fear keeps you careful. Just don't let it stop you. Tomorrow we fight back. I forwarded him the threatening text, then turned off my phone. Climbed into bed fully clothed, too exhausted to change. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes I saw my father's face. Not sick and tired like in that last photo, but the way I remembered him from childhood. Strong, laughing, lifting me onto his shoulders so I could see over the crowd at the 4th of July parade. Teaching me to read financial statements when I was 10 because he said numbers told stories better than words. Telling me that integrity mattered more than profit, that the people who worked for you weren't resources to be managed but human beings whose families depended on the choices you made. He tried to teach me everything he knew. I'd just been too angry about Victoria, too hurt by feeling excluded, to realize he was preparing me for this. For the moment when I'd have to step into his shoes and decide what kind of leader I wanted to be. The kind who chased profit at any cost, or the kind who remembered that behind every contract and every spreadsheet were real people trying to build real lives. Around 2 in the morning I gave up on sleep, made coffee and opened my laptop, started researching Palmer Industries, reading every article I could find about my father's business philosophy, the company's history, its reputation in the industry. What I found surprised me. Palmer Industries had started 40 years ago in a garage in Dorchester. My father fresh out of MIT with an engineering degree and $1,000 in savings. He'd invented a specialized valve system for medical equipment that made procedures safer and more efficient. One patent led to another. Within 10 years he built a small manufacturing empire, expanded into aerospace components, won government contracts. But what set him apart wasn't just innovation. It was how he treated his workers. Palmer Industries was famous for profit sharing, for promoting from within, for refusing to outsource jobs overseas even when it would have been more profitable. Article after article praised his ethics, his commitment to American manufacturing, his belief that business could be a force for good. But in the past 3 years something had changed. I found reports of worker complaints, a lawsuit from a former employee claiming safety violations, whispers about quality control issues on a major aerospace contract. Nothing concrete enough to damage the company's reputation, but enough to suggest cracks in the foundation. The most recent article, dated 2 months ago, mentioned a proposed merger with Blackwell Technologies, a private equity firm known for aggressive cost-cutting and mass layoffs. The board had voted to explore the merger. My father had voted against it. The final decision had been postponed until after the next quarterly review, which would have been this month. Except my father was dead, and now I was in charge. I sat back, the coffee growing cold in my hands. This wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about a battle for the soul of a company. My father had changed his will because he knew that Victoria and her children would sell to Blackwell in a heartbeat if it meant cashing out for hundreds of millions. Knew that 3,000 jobs would disappear within a year, as the company was gutted and flipped. Knew that everything he'd built, every value he'd stood for would be erased. He'd given me the company because he trusted me to fight for it, to protect the people who depended on it, to preserve the legacy that mattered more to him than money ever had. The weight of that trust settled over me like a blanket made of lead. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't have an MBA from Harvard. I'd never managed more than 2 part-time contractors. I'd never negotiated $1 million deal or faced down a hostile board, or held 3,000 livelihoods in my hands. But ready or not, tomorrow morning I'd walk into Thomas Garrett's office and start learning how. At 7 I showered, dressed in the most professional outfit I owned, a charcoal gray suit I'd bought for client presentations, and straightened my apartment even though no one would see it. Routine helped. Gave me something to control when everything else felt like chaos. At 8:30 Marcus texted. I'm downstairs. Ready? No, I typed. Good answer, he replied. Let's go anyway. I grabbed my bag, locked the apartment, and headed down to find Marcus waiting in his sedan. He handed me a coffee. Black, 2 sugars. How did you know? Your father told me. He knew everything about you, Jess. More than you realized. The drive to Thomas Garrett's office took 20 minutes through morning traffic. His firm occupied the top floor of a building near Boston Common. All glass walls and expensive furniture. The receptionist recognized me immediately, her eyes widening slightly. Miss Palmer, Mr. Garrett is expecting you. Conference room 3. Marcus and I followed her down a hallway lined with portraits of distinguished-looking attorneys, all white men except for one woman at the very end. The conference room had a view of the common, trees just starting to show their fall colors. Thomas was already there, along with Dr. Hoffman and 2 other people I didn't recognize. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a man about my age with a laptop open in front of him. Thomas stood when we entered. Jessica, thank you for coming. I think you know Dr. Hoffman. This is Patricia Chan. She's one of the senior partners here, and will be handling any legal challenges to the will. And this is David Kim, forensic accountant. We asked him to review Palmer Industries' financial records. The word forensic sent alarm bells ringing. Why do we need a forensic accountant? Patricia gestured for me to sit. Because your father suspected financial irregularities in the months before his death. He asked us to investigate quietly, without alerting anyone at the company. What we found is concerning. David turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was a spreadsheet filled with numbers I couldn't immediately parse. Over the past 18 months, approximately $47 million has been moved out of Palmer Industries through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. The transactions were carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic audits, but they form a clear pattern. Someone has been systematically embezzling from the company. The room tilted. $47 million. Who? David glanced at Thomas, who nodded. We traced the ultimate beneficiary of the shell companies. The money is flowing to accounts controlled by Derek Stone. I searched my memory. Derek Stone, I repeated. The financial advisor? Marcus's jaw tightened. He's been handling Palmer Industries investments for 5 years. He's also, I learned recently, romantically involved with your stepmother. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Victoria and Derek had been stealing from the company, probably planning to take even more once they got control through the merger. My father must have discovered it, must have realized that changing his will was the only way to stop them. Dr. Hoffman leaned forward. That's not all, Jessica. Your father came to me 8 months ago with concerning symptoms. Irregular heartbeat, shortness of breath, cognitive difficulties. I ran extensive tests. What I found was traces of digitalis in his blood. Digitalis, she paused, is a cardiac medication that in small therapeutic doses helps heart conditions. In larger doses, it causes the heart to stop. I felt like I was going to be sick. You're saying someone poisoned him. I'm saying your father was being given digitalis when he had no prescription for it and no medical need. The dosing was careful, gradual, designed to mimic a natural cardiac decline. By the time I identified it, the damage was already done. His heart had been weakened to the point where, she took a breath, where a final larger dose would be fatal. The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Marcus spoke first, his voice rough. You're telling us Richard was murdered? Dr. Hoffman nodded slowly. I reported my findings to him directly. He asked me not to go to the authorities yet. Said he needed time to protect Jessica first, to change his will, to gather evidence. 3 days later he was dead. The official cause was cardiac arrest, which was technically true. But it wasn't natural. I wanted to scream. To throw something. To rewind time and force my father to go to the police instead of trying to handle everything himself. Why didn't you come forward after he died? I demanded. Dr. Hoffman's eyes filled with tears. As I was terrified. Richard died suddenly at home with Victoria present. She called 911, performed CPR, played the devastated wife perfectly. By the time the ambulance arrived he was gone. An autopsy wasn't required because he had a documented heart condition. I had my suspicions but no proof that would hold up in court. And I knew that if I made accusations without evidence, whoever killed Richard might come after me next. So I stayed quiet, waited for the right moment. This is that moment. Patricia pulled out another folder. We've compiled everything we have. The medical records, the financial forensics, testimony from employees who noticed Derek Stone having private meetings with your father in the weeks before his death. Security footage from the Palmer estate showing Derek visiting the house repeatedly when your father was home alone. It's circumstantial, but it's enough to warrant a police investigation. The question is, what do you want to do? All eyes turned to me. What I wanted was to curl up in a ball and pretend none of this was real. What I wanted was my father back, alive and healthy and able to fight his own battles. What I wanted was to wake up in my small apartment, where the biggest problem in my life was landing the next web design client. But none of those things were possible. So instead I straightened my spine, looked Patricia in the eye, and said the only thing I could. We go to the police. We give them everything. And we make sure whoever did this pays for it. Marcus smiled grimly. That's going to make things very complicated. The media will have a field day. The company's stock could tank. Victoria will lawyer up immediately. Brandon and Lindsay might be implicated too if they knew what was happening. This will get ugly. I met his gaze. My father built Palmer Industries on integrity. He taught me that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing. So yes, it's going to get ugly. But we're doing it anyway. Thomas nodded approvingly. Then we move forward. I'll contact the district attorney's office this afternoon. Request a meeting. Patricia will prepare all documentation. David will provide expert testimony on the financial crimes. Dr. Hoffman, you'll need to give a full statement about the Digitalis findings. Marcus, you'll coordinate with the board. Prepare them for what's coming. And Jessica, he looked at me seriously, you need to prepare for war. Because once we file these reports, Victoria and Derek will come at you with everything they have. The police station on Tremont Street smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, a combination that made my stomach turn. Detective Sarah Morrison met us in the lobby, a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense handshake. She led us to a conference room with flickering fluorescent lights and a table scarred with coffee rings. Marcus, Thomas, Patricia, Dr. Hoffman and I sat on one side. Detective Morrison and her partner, a younger man named Detective Chun, sat across from us with recording equipment already set up. Thomas began by laying out the timeline. 6 months before his death, Richard Palmer changed his will, leaving control of Palmer Industries to his daughter Jessica. In the months leading to his death, he displayed symptoms consistent with Digitalis poisoning. 3 days before he died, he told his physician he had important business to complete before seeking hospitalization. $47 million was embezzled from his company through shell accounts connected to Derek Stone, who is romantically involved with Richard's widow, Victoria Palmer. Detective Morrison took notes without expression, her pen scratching across the pad in quick, efficient strokes. Dr. Hoffman spoke next, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She explained the medical findings, the blood tests showing Digitalis levels that shouldn't have been present, the gradual weakening of my father's heart over months. I documented everything, she said, but I didn't have access to the body after death. Victoria had him cremated within 48 hours. Detective Chun looked up sharply. That's unusually fast. Dr. Hoffman nodded. I thought so too. But she had all the legal authority as his wife. There was nothing I could do to stop it. Patricia slid copies of the financial documents across the table. David Kim, our forensic accountant, has traced these transactions over 18 months. The pattern is clear and deliberate. Money moved from Palmer Industries into shell corporations, then offshore, finally landing in accounts controlled by Derek Stone. The transfers accelerated in the final 3 months before Richard's death. Detective Morrison studied the spreadsheets, her frown deepening. This is sophisticated. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing. Which means, Patricia said quietly, they probably also knew how to cover their tracks regarding the poisoning. The detectives asked questions for 2 hours. What was my father's relationship with Victoria like? Had there been signs of conflict? Did I know Derek Stone personally? Had anyone made threats since the will was read? I answered everything as honestly as I could, though some truths hurt more than others. Yes, Victoria resented my father's affection for me. No, I didn't know the marriage was troubled beyond normal stepfamily tensions. Yes, Derek Stone had been to family dinners, always professional, always charming. No, the threats I'd received had been vague, nothing explicit enough to trace. Detective Morrison finally sat back, exchanging a long look with her partner. Miss Palmer, I want to be straight with you. What you've presented is compelling, but it's also circumstantial. Without the body, we can't prove poisoning definitively. The financial crimes are prosecutable, but proving Victoria or Derek directly caused your father's death is going to be extremely difficult. My chest tightened. So you're not going to investigate? That's not what I said, she replied. We'll absolutely investigate. We'll interview Victoria Palmer and Derek Stone. We'll subpoena financial records and phone records. We'll look for any physical evidence that might still exist. But I need you to understand that this is going to take time, and the outcome isn't guaranteed. Marcus leaned forward. Detective, 3,000 people work for Palmer Industries. If Victoria and Derek were willing to kill Richard to take control of that company, what do you think they'll do now that Jessica stands in their way? The implication hung in the air like smoke. Detective Morrison's expression hardened. We'll also be recommending protective measures. Miss Palmer, do you live alone? I nodded. Then I suggest you consider staying somewhere else temporarily. Somewhere they wouldn't expect. And don't go anywhere without someone you trust. She slid a card across the table. My direct number. You call me if anything seems off. Anything at all. We left the station as afternoon sun broke through the clouds, turning the street into a river of gold. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scraped everything inside me and left only the shell. Marcus touched my shoulder gently. Come stay at my place. I have a guest room. You shouldn't be alone right now. I wanted to argue, to insist I could take care of myself. But the truth was I was terrified. So I nodded. Just for a few days. Until things settle down. Things aren't going to settle down, Patricia said bluntly. They're going to get worse before they get better. The district attorney's office will want to interview you. The media is going to start digging. And once Victoria realizes the police are investigating, she'll go nuclear. She was right. By that evening, my phone exploded with calls from reporters. Someone had leaked the story. The headlines started appearing online around 7. Palmer Industries heiress claims father was murdered. Boston manufacturing titan's death under investigation. Family fortune sparks poisoning allegations. I sat in Marcus's guest room, a comfortable space with cream-colored walls and a view of his garden, watching my life become a spectacle. Marcus brought me soup I couldn't eat. You need to stop reading those, he said gently, gesturing at my phone. They don't know anything. They're just speculating. But the speculation was brutal. Comment sections filled with people who thought I was a gold digger trying to smear my stepmother. Others defended me, pointing out that Victoria stood to gain from my father's death. A few noted that the timing of the will change and the embezzlement timeline suggested my father had known something was wrong. The worst were the threats. Anonymous accounts telling me I'd regret making accusations, warning me that rich families had ways of dealing with problems, promising that I'd end up like my father if I didn't back down. I forwarded everything to Detective Morrison as instructed. She called me back within an hour. We're tracking these accounts. Most are using VPNs and burner phones, but we'll find them. In the meantime, I meant what I said. Don't go anywhere alone. I'm serious, Jessica. People who embezzle $47 million and potentially commit murder aren't going to hesitate to tie up loose ends. The fear was constant now, a low hum beneath everything else. I couldn't sleep without imagining footsteps in the hallway. Couldn't eat without wondering if someone might poison my food the way they'd poison my father. Marcus installed extra locks on his doors and a security camera by the entrance. He didn't make a big deal of it, just did it quietly while I was on a call with Thomas. 3 days after we went to the police, Victoria's attorney issued a public statement. My client is devastated by these baseless accusations during her time of grief. She loved her husband deeply and would never harm him. The allegations of financial impropriety are similarly unfounded and appear to be a calculated attempt by Richard Palmer's daughter to monopolize the family estate. We will be pursuing legal action for defamation. The statement was slick and professional, painting me as a vindictive daughter upset about being excluded from the family. It might have worked too, except that afternoon the district attorney's office announced they were formally investigating Richard Palmer's death and related financial crimes. The press conference was brief. DA Michael Torres stood at a podium surrounded by microphones, his expression grave. We have received credible evidence suggesting that Richard Palmer's death may not have been from natural causes. We are also investigating allegations of embezzlement from Palmer Industries. This is an active investigation, and we cannot comment on specific details at this time. But I want to be clear that we take these matters extremely seriously. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact our office. The reporters erupted with questions. Is Victoria Palmer a suspect? What about Derek Stone? How much money was stolen? DA Torres refused to answer, simply repeated that the investigation was ongoing, and thanked everyone for coming. I watched the press conference from Marcus's living room, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. This is really happening, I said quietly. We're really doing this. Marcus sat beside me. Your father would be proud. He spent his whole life building something good, something that mattered. You're fighting to protect that. It's exactly what he would have wanted. But at what cost? I turned to look at him. My face is all over the news. Half the city thinks I'm a liar. Victoria's attorneys are going to come after me. What if we can't prove it? What if they get away with it? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, he said firmly. But right now, today, you're doing the right thing. That has to be enough. That night I dreamed about my father. We were in his office at Palmer Industries, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. He sat behind his massive desk, the same desk that was now technically mine, and smiled at me the way he used to when I was a child. You're stronger than you think, Jess, he said. You always have been. I tried to respond but no sound came out. He stood, walked around the desk, and put his hand on my shoulder. The weight of it felt real, solid, comforting. Don't let them make you small. You were born for this. I woke up with tears on my face and morning light streaming through the window. My phone showed 6 missed calls from Thomas and a text from Patricia. We need to meet. Victoria's team filed a motion to freeze the will pending investigation of undue influence. They're claiming your father wasn't competent when he changed it. I stared at the message, rage replacing fear. Undue influence. They were arguing that I'd somehow manipulated my father, a man I'd barely seen in the months before his death, into leaving me everything. It was absurd. It was also legally plausible if they could find the right expert witnesses to testify about his mental state. I called Patricia back immediately. Can they actually do this? Her voice was tense. They can try. It's a common tactic in contested wills. But we have your father's recorded testimony explaining his reasoning. We have medical records showing he was cognitively sound. And we have the fact that he made these changes 6 months before his death, not in some last-minute deathbed decision. Their case is weak, but it'll tie things up for months while it works through the courts. Which is probably the point, I said. Keep me from taking control of the company long enough for them to do whatever they're planning. Exactly, Patricia confirmed. Which is why we're going to file a counter-motion arguing that you should be allowed to assume the CEO position immediately under the terms of the will, with the understanding that if the will is later overturned, you'd be required to step down. It's aggressive, but given the evidence of embezzlement, we can argue that delay puts the company at further risk. Do it, I said. Whatever it takes. I'm not letting them steal this. Not from me and not from the 3,000 people who work there. We scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon at Thomas's office. I borrowed professional clothes from Marcus's sister, a lawyer herself who kept spare suits at his place for early meetings. The charcoal blazer fit perfectly, made me look older, more authoritative. I studied myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 2 weeks ago I'd been designing websites in yoga pants. Now I was preparing to fight for control of an $800 million company. The meeting included Thomas, Patricia, Marcus, and 2 additional attorneys from their firm specializing in corporate law. They laid out the strategy on a whiteboard like it was a military campaign. Step 1. File the countermotion to allow immediate CEO transition. Step 2. Call an emergency board meeting to brief them on the investigation and reassure them about company stability. Step 3. Secure the support of key shareholders who might otherwise side with Victoria. Step 4. Prepare for media interviews to control the narrative. Each step had subtasks, deadlines, people responsible. It was overwhelming and precise and exactly what we needed. Patricia handled most of the talking. Jessica, you need to understand that the board meeting is going to be hostile. Several members were loyal to your father, but others have been pushing for the Blackwell merger. They're going to see you as an obstacle to a massive payout. You'll need to convince them that keeping Palmer Industries independent is better for everyone in the long run. How do I do that? I asked. I don't have their experience. I don't know the industry like they do. You know what your father knew, Marcus said. That this company is worth more than its sale price. That the people who work here matter. That short-term profit isn't worth destroying something that took 40 years to build. You speak from that place, from integrity, and you'll win over the ones who still remember why they got into this business in the first place. One of the corporate attorneys, a man named Robert Foster, spoke up. You should also know that Derek Stone has been suspended from his position as financial advisor pending the criminal investigation. But he's hired Gerald Moss as his attorney. Moss is, he paused, extremely good at making criminal charges disappear for wealthy clients. This won't be easy. Nothing about this is easy, I said. But we're not backing down. Robert smiled slightly. Good. Because your father was one of the best men I ever knew. I'd like to help make sure his legacy doesn't get destroyed by people who only see dollar signs. We worked until midnight, drafting motions and statements, rehearsing answers to likely questions, building the framework for a defense that was also an offense. By the time Marcus drove me back to his house, I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. But my mind kept racing. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 5 days away. 5 days to prepare for the most important presentation of my life. 5 days to convince powerful people that I deserved to lead them. 5 days to prove I was Richard Palmer's daughter in the ways that actually mattered. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Patricia coached me on board meeting protocol. Marcus walked me through Palmer Industries' current contracts, profit margins, growth projections. Thomas reviewed every legal document related to the company's founding, its mission statement, its commitments to employees and communities. I absorbed it all like someone drowning, grasping for anything that might keep me afloat. By Monday night, I could recite key financial figures in my sleep. Revenue per quarter, profit margins on major contracts, employee retention rates, safety records, innovation patents filed over the past decade. But facts weren't enough. I needed a story. Needed to make them see what my father had seen when he built this company, what he'd fought to preserve when others wanted to cash out. So I spent Monday night writing. Not a business presentation but a narrative. About a young engineer from Dorchester who believed that American manufacturing could compete with anyone in the world if it held itself to the highest standards. About a man who treated his workers like family and built a reputation for quality that attracted the most demanding clients. About a legacy that was worth more than the sum of its parts, that represented something rare and precious in an age where everything was disposable. By 2 in the morning I had 5 pages. By 4 I'd cut it to 3. By 6, when Marcus knocked on the guest room door with coffee, I had it memorized. He read through it once, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me with something like, "Ah, this is good, Jess. Really good. Your father would have loved this." "I hope the board does too," I said. "Because if they don't, I'm out before I even started." "We'll find out soon enough," he replied. "The meeting's at 9. Time to get ready." I dressed in a navy blue suit Patricia had helped me pick out, the kind of outfit that said competent professional without trying too hard. Pearl earrings my father had given me for my college graduation. Minimal makeup. Hair pulled back in a neat bun. When I looked in the mirror I saw my mother, the woman I'd never met but whose photos showed the same dark eyes, the same determined set to the jaw. I wondered if she would have been proud of me, if she would have understood what I was trying to do. Then I pushed the thought away. Today wasn't about her or about me. It was about honoring my father's life's work. Palmer Industries Tower rose into a gray sky threatening rain. Marcus and I rode the elevator to the 40th floor in silence, the numbers climbing with agonizing slowness. The executive offices were all glass and steel, modern and cold. A receptionist whose name tag read Jennifer looked up as we entered. "Miss Palmer," she said, her voice warm. "I worked with your father for 12 years. I just want you to know that a lot of us are rooting for you." "Thank you," I managed. "That means more than you know." She smiled sadly. "He was a good man. One of the best. Please don't let them destroy what he built." The boardroom was already full when we arrived. 12 people sat around a massive table, 11 men and 1 woman, all over 50, all dressed in expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. They looked up as I entered, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, my father's chair. Marcus had told me it was customary for the CEO to sit there. I walked toward it with my heart hammering so loud, I was sure everyone could hear it. Before I could sit, a man I recognized as Theodore Blackwell, the CEO of Blackwell Technologies, stood up. "With all due respect, Miss Palmer, I'm not sure it's appropriate for you to take that seat given the ongoing legal questions about the will's validity." His voice was smooth, cultured, dismissive. I met his gaze directly. "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell, my father's will is legally binding until a court rules otherwise. I'm the designated CEO. This is my seat." I sat down before he could respond. The room went silent. Then Marcus took the seat beside me, and Thomas sat on my other side. Patricia remained standing near the door, a silent reminder that legal counsel was present. I placed my folder on the table, took a breath, and began. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. I know the past 2 weeks have been difficult and confusing. I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room. Yes, I'm 28 years old. Yes, I've never worked in manufacturing. Yes, I'm sure many of you are wondering what my father was thinking when he left me this company." I paused, letting the honesty land. I've been wondering the same thing. But I've also spent the past week learning everything I can about Palmer Industries. And I've realized something. My father didn't choose me because I have the most experience or the best credentials. He chose me because he trusted me to remember what this company is really about. I opened my folder and pulled out a photo. It showed my father standing in the original factory in Dorchester, surrounded by workers, all of them smiling. This was taken 35 years ago. Palmer Industries employed 50 people then. They made specialized valves for medical equipment. Every valve that left that factory had my father's signature on the quality control sheet. Not because he was arrogant, but because he wanted customers to know that he personally guaranteed the work. That level of commitment is why Palmer Industries grew. It's why we have contracts with aerospace companies and medical device manufacturers who demand perfection. It's why 3,000 people have jobs that pay fair wages with profit sharing and benefits. Because my father understood that quality isn't just about products. It's about people. I looked around the table. Several board members were leaning forward now, listening. Theodore Blackwell's expression hadn't changed, but his jaw was tight. "I know some of you support the merger with Blackwell Technologies," I continued. "The financial terms are attractive. We'd all make a substantial amount of money. But I've looked at Blackwell's track record with acquisitions. Within 18 months of every merger, workforce is cut by at least 40%. Manufacturing moves overseas. Quality standards drop because the focus shifts from excellence to efficiency. And yes, shareholders profit. But the communities that depended on those jobs suffer. The reputation built over decades evaporates. The legacy dies." Now I pulled out the spreadsheets David had prepared. I also know that in the 18 months before my father's death, $47 million was embezzled from this company through shell corporations. The district attorney is currently investigating Derek Stone in connection with these crimes. My father discovered this theft, which is why he changed his will. He knew that allowing certain people to take control of Palmer Industries would result in its destruction. Not just financially but morally. The room erupted. Board members talked over each other, some demanding details, others looking shocked. Theodore Blackwell's face went red. "This is slander," he said loudly. "You have no evidence connecting me to any financial impropriety." "I didn't say your name, Mr. Blackwell," I replied calmly. "But since you brought it up, perhaps you'd like to explain why Derek Stone, who was orchestrating the embezzlement, was also your primary contact regarding the merger negotiations." The room went quiet. Marcus slid another document across the table. Email correspondence between Derek Stone and Blackwell Technologies discussing merger terms 3 months before the board was officially notified. suggesting that information about Palmer Industries' financial status was being shared without authorization, potentially constituting corporate espionage. Theodore stood so abruptly his chair fell backward. I don't have to listen to this. He started toward the door, but Patricia stepped in front of it. Actually, Mr. Blackwell, you do. As a board member, you're required to attend meetings called by the CEO. And you might want to hear the rest, because the DA's office has subpoenaed all communications between you and Derek Stone. Leaving now might look like consciousness of guilt. He froze. The other board members stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Slowly, he picked up his chair and sat back down. I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to save this company. My father spent 40 years building something that mattered, something that proved American manufacturing could thrive by maintaining the highest standards. I intend to honor that. Which means no merger with Blackwell Technologies. Which means investigating and eliminating any corruption within our ranks. Which means returning to the values that made Palmer Industries successful in the first place. A woman at the far end of the table, Margaret Chun, the company's chief technology officer, spoke up. What's your plan for growth? If we don't merge, how do we compete with larger conglomerates? I pulled out the final document in my folder. I've been working with Marcus to develop a 5-year strategic plan. It focuses on 3 areas. First, innovation. We double our R&D budget and focus on emerging technologies in medical robotics and sustainable aerospace components. Second, workforce development. We partner with MIT and other engineering schools to create apprenticeship programs that pipeline talent directly to us. Third, strategic partnerships rather than mergers. We stay independent but form alliances with companies that share our values. It's not the fastest path to profit, but it's sustainable. It protects jobs. And it preserves what makes us special. Margaret studied the plan, flipping through pages. This is actually viable, she said slowly. The numbers work. The market analysis is solid. Where did you learn to put together something like this? I admitted. I had help from people who believed in what my father built and want to see it continue. But I understand the vision. And I'm willing to work harder than anyone in this room to make it happen. Because this isn't just a job to me. It's my father's legacy. It's 3,000 families depending on us to get this right. It's proof that business can be about more than just maximizing shareholder value. Another board member, James Foster, cleared his throat. Miss Palmer, I knew your father for 20 years. Served on this board since the beginning. And I have to say you sound more like him than anyone I've heard in a long time. Richard always said that the moment we forget why we started this company is the moment we should sell it. He fought the merger because he couldn't forget. Looking at you now, I don't think you'll forget either. Several heads nodded around the table. Theodore Blackwell sat rigid, his expression murderous. The vote, he said coldly. We should vote on whether to accept Jessica Palmer as CEO or pursue alternate leadership. I agree, I said. Let's vote. Thomas stood. All in favor of accepting Jessica Palmer as CEO of Palmer Industries, effective immediately, please raise your hands. I held my breath. Marcus's hand went up first. Then Margaret's. Then James's. Slowly others followed. When the count finished, 9 hands were raised. Only Theodore Blackwell and 2 others, both known allies of his, voted against. Thomas's voice was formal. The motion passes. Jessica Palmer is confirmed as CEO. I exhaled, dizzy with relief and terror. Confirmed. It was real. I was actually going to do this. Theodore stood again, this time successfully making it to the door. You're making a mistake, he said to the room generally. This company will fail under inexperienced leadership. And when it does, don't say I didn't warn you. After he left, the atmosphere lightened considerably. Board members came up to shake my hand, offer congratulations, promise their support. Margaret pulled me aside. Your father talked about you constantly, she said quietly. He was so proud of you even when you weren't around. I think he always knew you'd end up here eventually. He just wanted to make sure you were ready. I'm not sure I am, I admitted. Then you're exactly like him, she smiled. He never thought he was ready either. He just kept showing up and doing the work. That's all any of us can do. The week after the board meeting passed in a blur of 12-hour days and emergency decisions that felt like juggling knives while learning to walk a tightrope. My first official act as CEO was to hire a security firm after Detective Morrison called to say they traced 2 of the threatening messages back to burner phones purchased near Derek Stone's apartment. "You're in real danger," she said bluntly. "These people have already killed once. They won't hesitate to do it again if they think you're a threat to their freedom." So now I had a bodyguard named Luis Rodriguez, a former Marine who stood 6'4" and had the kind of calm presence that made me feel marginally safer. He drove me to Palmer Industries Tower every morning at 6 and didn't leave until I was locked inside Marcus's house every night. The media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside the building, shouting questions every time I entered or left. "Is your stepmother a murderer? Did your father really trust you to run his company? Are you qualified for this position?" I learned to keep my head down, offer no comment, and let Patricia handle all press inquiries. Inside the company, I faced a different kind of scrutiny. Employees watched me constantly, measuring every decision against the standard my father had set. I spent the first 3 days just walking the floors, introducing myself to people whose names I tried desperately to remember, listening to their concerns about the investigation and the merger talks and what my leadership would mean for their jobs. I promised transparency and stability, though I had no idea if I could deliver either. What I did have was sincerity. I genuinely cared about these people, about preserving the company culture my father had built, and apparently that came through because slowly, cautiously, they started to trust me. The criminal investigation accelerated faster than anyone expected. Detective Morrison called me on Thursday morning with news that made my coffee go cold in my hands. "We executed search warrants on Victoria Palmer's residence and Derek Stone's apartment this morning. What we found is substantial. Financial documents showing the embezzlement scheme in detail. Communications between Victoria and Derek discussing your father's deteriorating health in ways that suggest foreknowledge. And most damning, a bottle of prescription Digitalis in Derek's bathroom cabinet. He has no heart condition. There's no legitimate reason for him to possess that medication." My hands shook as I set down my phone. They were going to arrest them. Actually arrest them for murdering my father. The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. Victoria, who had tucked me into bed when I was 4 years old, who had made pancakes on Saturday mornings, who had also made me feel unwelcome in my own home for 20 years. Derek, who had seemed so professional and trustworthy, who had smiled at family dinners while plotting to steal everything my father built. They had killed him. Slowly, carefully, deliberately poisoned him until his heart gave out, all so they could take his money and his company. The arrests happened that afternoon. News helicopters circled Victoria's house as police led her out in handcuffs, her face frozen in an expression of shocked outrage. Derek was arrested at his office downtown, surrounded by his own employees who watched in stunned silence. The footage played on every channel over and over until I couldn't watch anymore. Brandon and Lindsay held a press conference denying any knowledge of their mother's actions, their lawyer carefully distancing them from the charges. They looked genuinely devastated, and part of me felt sorry for them. They'd lost their mother to prison and whatever inheritance they might have expected. But another part of me remembered how they'd treated me at the funeral, how eager they'd been to erase me from the family story. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Patricia explained that the DA would present evidence to determine if there was enough to proceed to trial. Given what they'd found, she was confident the case would move forward. "Your testimony will be crucial," she told me. "You'll need to establish your father's mental state in the months before his death, his concerns about the company, the changes to his will. The defense will try to paint him as paranoid or manipulated. You need to show that he was clear-headed and acting rationally." I spent hours with Patricia preparing, going over every conversation I'd had with my father in that final year, every phone call, every text message. There weren't many. I'd been so caught up in my own life, so hurt by years of feeling excluded, that I'd let the distance between us grow. That guilt sat heavy in my chest, a weight that never lifted. While the criminal case built momentum, I focused on stabilizing Palmer Industries. The embezzlement had created holes in the budget that needed immediate attention. I worked with Marcus and our CFO to restructure payments, renegotiate some vendor contracts, and implement new financial controls to prevent future theft. It was exhausting work that required me to learn accounting principles I'd never studied and make decisions about millions of dollars with consequences I could barely comprehend. But I showed up every day, asked questions when I didn't understand, and slowly started to grasp the machinery of running a company this size. The hardest part was earning the respect of executives who'd worked in manufacturing for decades. During my second week, I sat in on a production meeting where the head of operations, a man named Frank Castillo who'd been with the company for 30 years, openly questioned my decision to maintain current safety standards rather than cutting costs. With all due respect, Miss Palmer, your father could afford to be idealistic because he built this company from nothing. You inherited it. There's a difference. The room went silent, everyone waiting to see how I'd respond. I met Frank's gaze directly. You're right. I didn't build this company, but I understand what it cost my father to maintain those standards. He turned down contracts that would have made him richer because they required compromises he wasn't willing to make. He believed that the workers on this floor deserved to go home safe every night. I believe that too. So we're keeping the safety standards. If that makes us less competitive, we'll find other ways to cut costs that don't risk human lives. Frank studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. The rest of the meeting proceeded without challenge, and afterward Margaret pulled me aside. That was well done. Frank respected your father immensely. He was testing you to see if you'd cave under pressure. You didn't. Word will spread. By the end of that day, I felt like I'd cleared some invisible hurdle. People started meeting my eyes in the hallways, offering real smiles instead of polite ones. The skepticism didn't disappear, but it softened, replaced by cautious optimism. Maybe this young woman who'd never worked in manufacturing actually understood what mattered. Maybe she really was Richard Palmer's daughter in the ways that counted. 3 weeks into my tenure as CEO, I gave my first major interview. Patricia had arranged it carefully, choosing a respected business journalist known for tough but fair reporting. We met in my office, the one that had been my father's, that I'd slowly made my own by adding plants and removing some of the more intimidating furniture. The journalist, a woman named Andrea Torres, asked the questions I'd been dreading. How do you respond to critics who say you're too young and inexperienced for this role? What makes you think you can succeed where more qualified candidates might have failed? Do you believe your stepmother really killed your father? Or is this a convenient narrative to justify your inheritance? I answered each question as honestly as I could. I don't have decades of industry experience. What I have is a clear understanding of my father's vision and the determination to see it through. I'm learning every day, leaning on people who know more than I do, and making decisions based on the values he taught me. As for Victoria, I said carefully, I'm not the prosecutor. I don't decide guilt or innocence. But I do know that the evidence is compelling, and I trust the justice system to handle it appropriately. What I can control is making sure Palmer Industries continues to be a company worth inheriting, one that treats people with dignity and produces work we can be proud of. The article came out 3 days later under the headline, "The Reluctant Heiress Fighting to Save Her Father's Legacy." It was fair and nuanced, painting me as someone thrust into an impossible situation who was trying her best. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Employees told me they'd seen it, that they appreciated my honesty. Industry analysts started writing pieces suggesting that maybe Palmer Industries was in good hands after all. The company's stock, which had dropped 15% after the arrests, began to recover. Small victories, but they mattered. The preliminary hearing arrived on a gray October morning that felt appropriate for the occasion. Sat in the courtroom gallery beside Marcus and Dr. Hoffman, watching as Victoria and Derek were let in wearing suits instead of jumpsuits, their lawyers flanking them like defensive walls. Victoria's eyes swept the room and landed on me. The hatred in her gaze was so intense I felt it physically, like standing too close to a fire. Derek looked smaller somehow, diminished, his usual confidence stripped away by the reality of what he faced. Life in prison if convicted. Everything he'd schemed for reduced to nothing. The DA, Michael Torres, presented the case methodically. He called Dr. Hoffman first, who testified about the digitalis poisoning, the gradual weakening of my father's heart, the medical impossibility of the levels found in his blood occurring naturally. The defense attorney, Gerald Moss, tried to shake her testimony by suggesting contamination of the samples or misreading of the results, but Dr. Hoffman held firm. I documented everything according to proper medical protocol. The findings are unambiguous. Richard Palmer was poisoned over a period of months with a cardiac medication he had no prescription for and no medical need of. David Kim testified next, walking the court through the embezzlement scheme with charts and spreadsheets that showed the money trail from Palmer Industries to shell companies to Derek Stone's accounts. The defense suggested the transfers could have been legitimate investment strategies, but David systematically dismantled that argument. These transactions were deliberately structured to avoid detection and reporting requirements. The complexity of the scheme indicates sophisticated knowledge of financial systems and intent to conceal. There's no innocent explanation for this pattern. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand with my heart trying to escape my chest, placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. D.A. Torres asked me to describe my father's mental state in the final months of his life. He was clear and purposeful, I said. Concerned about the company's direction, worried about people he'd trusted. He told me he had important decisions to make, that he needed to protect what he'd built. There was nothing confused or paranoid about him. He was responding rationally to real threats. Did he ever express concerns about Victoria Palmer or Derek Stone specifically? Not in those terms. But he did say I should be careful, that not everyone in his life had his best interests at heart. He asked me to trust Marcus and Dr. Hoffman if anything happened to him. It was like he knew, like he was preparing for the possibility that he might not survive whatever was happening. Gerald Moss cross-examined me with the kind of smooth aggression that made me understand why he was so successful. Isn't it true, Miss Palmer, that you had a strained relationship with your stepmother? That you resented her presence in your father's life? I acknowledged that our relationship was complicated but denied that my testimony was motivated by personal animosity. Moss pressed harder. Isn't it convenient that your father's alleged murder comes to light only after you inherit everything? That these accusations serve to delegitimize any challenge to a will that benefits you exclusively? I felt my temper flare but kept my voice level. What's convenient is that my father is dead and can't defend himself. What's inconvenient is that two people he trusted apparently poisoned him so they could steal his company. I'm not making accusations for personal gain. I'm seeking justice for a man who deserved better. The judge called for order as whispers filled the courtroom. Moss tried a few more angles but I held steady, refusing to be rattled. When I finally stepped down, I felt wrung out and fragile. Marcus squeezed my shoulder as I sat back down. You did good, he whispered. Really good. The hearing lasted 2 more days as additional witnesses testified and evidence was presented. Police officers described what they'd found during the searches. Financial experts confirmed the embezzlement. Communications specialists analyzed emails and text messages between Victoria and Derek that showed suspicious coordination of their stories. By the end, the judge's decision seemed inevitable. The court finds sufficient evidence to bind over both defendants for trial on charges of first-degree murder and multiple counts of embezzlement and financial fraud. Trial is set to begin in January. Bail is denied given the severity of the charges and flight risk. The gavel struck and Victoria screamed, her composure finally shattering. This is a travesty. That girl is lying. She pointed at me across the courtroom. You poisoned him against me. You stole everything. Guards moved to restrain her as her lawyer tried to calm her down. Derek sat motionless, his face gray, already defeated. I watched them being led away and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just emptiness where my father should have been. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed us. Patricia gave a brief statement expressing our confidence in the justice system and requesting privacy as we prepared for trial. I stood beside her, Luis keeping the cameras at a distance, and said nothing. What was there to say? My father was still dead. Victoria's conviction wouldn't bring him back. The money and the company meant nothing compared to one more conversation with him, one more chance to tell him I understood what he'd been trying to teach me all along. That night I sat in my new apartment, a secure building in Back Bay that Luis had helped me find, and finally let myself cry. Not the angry tears of the funeral or the frustrated tears of the investigation. Just grief, pure and simple, for the father I'd loved imperfectly and lost too soon. The trial began in January on a morning so cold the harbor had ice forming at its edges. I attended every day that I could manage, sitting in the gallery and listening to testimony that painted my father's final months in heartbreaking detail. Employees testified about noticing Victoria and Derek in suspicious late-night meetings at the office. A pharmacist testified about Derek purchasing Digitalis using a false prescription. A forensic pathologist explained how the drug would have affected my father's body, causing increasing chest pain, shortness of breath, weakness, until finally a larger dose triggered fatal cardiac arrest. The prosecution built their case methodically, piece by piece, until the picture was undeniable. The defense strategy was to create reasonable doubt by suggesting the poisoning could have been accidental, that Derek possessed the Digitalis for legitimate reasons they couldn't disclose due to privacy concerns, that the embezzlement was a separate matter blown out of proportion. They painted Victoria as a grieving widow being persecuted by a vindictive stepdaughter, Derek as a scapegoat for financial irregularities he didn't fully understand. It was slick and professional and might have worked if the evidence hadn't been so overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 3 days, a time during which I barely slept or ate, just waited for the verdict that would determine whether my father's death would be avenged or dismissed. When the call finally came, I was in a meeting with department heads about next quarter's production schedule. My phone buzzed and Patricia's name appeared. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. "They're back," she said. "Verdict in an hour. Can you make it?" I told Marcus to cancel the rest of my meetings and Luis drove me to the courthouse through afternoon traffic, arriving just as the jury filed back into the courtroom. I took my seat in the gallery, hands clenched together so tightly my knuckles went white. Victoria and Derek stood as the judge entered. Their faces were masks revealing nothing. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The four women stood. "We have, Your Honor. In the case of the Commonwealth versus Victoria Palmer and Derek Stone, on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find?" The forewoman's voice was clear and firm. "We find both defendants guilty." The courtroom erupted. Victoria collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Derek stood rigid, staring straight ahead. Behind me, I heard Dr. Hoffman crying quietly with relief. The judge called for order, then continued through the remaining charges. Guilty on all counts of embezzlement. Guilty on conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty on every single charge the prosecution had brought. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Patricia explained that they both faced life in prison without possibility of parole. The embezzlement charges alone carried decades of prison time, and the murder conviction ensured they'd never be free again. Brandon and Lindsay issued a statement through their attorney expressing shock and condemning their mother's actions, though I doubted many people believed they truly had no idea what was happening. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I'd heard enough, seen enough. What I needed now wasn't closure from watching them be led away to prison. What I needed was to build something worthy of my father's sacrifice. Spring came to Boston with sudden warmth that turned the common green overnight and brought flowers blooming in Marcus's garden. I'd moved into a new house by then, a modest place in Jamaica Plain with good security, and a small yard where I could sit outside without bodyguards hovering. Luis still drove me to work, but the threat level had decreased significantly once Victoria and Derek were behind bars. The company was stabilizing under my leadership, slowly finding its rhythm again. We'd landed 2 major contracts, including one with a medical device company that represented exactly the kind of ethical, innovative work my father had valued. I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom on a Saturday morning, adjusting the collar of a simple black dress. Today was the unveiling of my father's memorial, a statue we'd commissioned for the lobby of Palmer Industries Tower. The artist had captured him perfectly, standing with his hands in his pockets, a slight smile on his face, looking toward the future with confidence and hope. The inscription at the base read, "Richard Palmer, builder, innovator, believer in the dignity of work and the worth of every person." Employees and board members gathered in the lobby at noon. I'd invited everyone, from the executive team to the maintenance staff, because my father had valued them all equally. Marcus introduced me and I stepped to the podium we'd set up beside the covered statue. I'd written and rewritten my remarks a dozen times, trying to find words adequate to the moment. In the end, I'd settled on simplicity. My father built this company on a foundation of integrity and respect. He believed that business could be a force for good in the world, that profit and principles didn't have to be enemies. In the months since his death, I've learned just how rare that perspective is and how precious. I paused, looking out at the faces watching me. Some had tears in their eyes. Some smiled encouragingly. All of them had shown up, which meant something. He gave me this company not because I was the most qualified person to run it, but because he trusted me to preserve what he'd spent a lifetime building. That trust is both a gift and a burden. Some days I'm not sure I'm equal to it. But I show up anyway. I keep trying because that's what he taught me. That showing up matters. That doing the right thing even when it's hard matters. That every person in this building matters. I pulled the cord and the fabric fell away, revealing the bronze statue gleaming in the afternoon light streaming through the lobby windows. People applauded, a few called out my father's name, and I stepped back to stand beside Marcus. He put his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that was paternal and comforting. "He'd be proud of you, Jess. So proud." "I know," I said quietly. "And that means everything." 6 months after the trial, I gave a speech at an industry conference about the future of American manufacturing. I talked about quality over quantity, about the value of skilled workers, about refusing to sacrifice long-term sustainability for short-term profits. The audience responded with a standing ovation. Afterward, several other CEOs approached me, wanting to discuss collaboration, partnerships, ways we could work together to prove that manufacturing in America could thrive without exploiting workers or cutting corners. It felt like the beginning of something larger than Palmer Industries, a movement my father would have championed. I went back to the cemetery on the anniversary of his death, this time alone. The headstone was simple granite engraved with his name and dates and a single line I'd chosen. He built a legacy of integrity. I sat on the grass beside the marker and told him everything. About the trial, about the company's growth, about the partnerships we'd formed and the innovations we were developing. About how I'd finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me all those years. That wealth without purpose was meaningless. That power without responsibility was dangerous. That the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated but what you contributed. I told him I was sorry for the distance I'd let grow between us. Sorry I hadn't come to that last dinner. Sorry I'd let my hurt feelings about Victoria blind me to his love. And I told him thank you. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For giving me the chance to prove I was worthy of his name. For teaching me that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees around the cemetery, and for just a moment it felt like an answer. Like he heard me and understood and forgave me for being human, for being imperfect, for taking so long to figure out what he'd known all along. That evening I drove to Palmer Industries Tower and rode the elevator to my office. The building was mostly empty, just security guards and a few dedicated employees. Working late. I stood at the window looking out over the harbor, watching lights from boats drift across dark water. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret about a meeting tomorrow to discuss the R&D budget. Another from Marcus reminding me about a board presentation next week. A third from Patricia checking on how I was doing. The people who'd become my team, my family. The ones who showed up every day to help carry the weight my father had left me. At my father's funeral, they told me to sit down and stay quiet. They tried to erase me from his story, to steal the legacy he'd spent 40 years building. But when the lawyer read those words, when he announced that everything my father created was now mine, the real battle began. Not for money or power, but for the preservation of values that seemed increasingly rare in a world obsessed with profit margins and quarterly returns. I didn't win that battle by being the smartest or the most experienced. I won it by remembering what my father taught me. That integrity isn't negotiable. That people matter more than profits. That sometimes the dead speak loudest through the choices we make in their honor. Palmer Industries thrived not despite my leadership, but because I refused to compromise on the principles my father had instilled in every brick of the foundation he'd laid. Victoria and Derek took his life, but they couldn't take his legacy. That belonged to the 3,000 employees who came to work every day knowing they were valued. It belonged to the communities we supported and the standards we maintained. It belonged to the future we were building, one ethical decision at a time. And it belonged to me, the daughter who'd felt invisible for so long, who finally understood that she'd been seen all along. That she'd been loved and trusted and prepared for exactly this moment. The city lights blurred as tears filled my eyes. Not tears of grief anymore, but something else. Gratitude maybe. Or recognition. The knowledge that my father's death hadn't been in vain, that justice had been served, that his company would endure. I pressed my hand against the cool glass and whispered into the empty office. I did it, Dad. I kept my promise. The harbor stretched dark and vast before me, but somewhere beyond the horizon, dawn was already preparing to break. And when it came, I'd be ready to meet it. The second year of my leadership brought challenges I hadn't anticipated, the kind that couldn't be solved with integrity alone. A major client, Garrison Aerospace, threatened to pull their contract worth $60 million annually unless we agreed to move production overseas where labor costs were a fraction of what we paid in Boston. Their CEO, a man named Harold Garrison who'd worked with my father for 15 years, called me personally to deliver the ultimatum. Jessica, I respect what you're trying to do, but my board is demanding cost reductions. If Palmer Industries can't be competitive, we'll have to find suppliers who can. I sat in my office after that call, staring at spreadsheets that showed exactly how devastating losing Garrison would be. $60 million in revenue supported nearly 400 jobs directly, and another 200 indirectly through suppliers and contractors. If we lost that contract, I'd have to make layoffs for the first time since taking over. Everything my father had built, everything I'd fought to preserve would start crumbling. Marcus found me there at 7 in the evening, still staring at numbers that wouldn't add up the way I needed them to. Talk to me, he said quietly, sitting across from my desk. I told him about Garrison's ultimatum, about the impossible choice between maintaining our principles and keeping people employed. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. Then he said something that changed my perspective entirely. Your father faced this exact situation 20 years ago. Different clients, same pressure. You know what he did? He called their bluff. Told them that if they wanted Palmer Industries quality, they'd pay Palmer Industries prices. Half of them walked away. The other half stayed because they realized you can't find our level of craftsmanship anywhere else. And within 2 years, the ones who left came crawling back because their cheaper suppliers couldn't deliver. But what if Garrison doesn't come back? I asked. What if I'm wrong and we lose everything? Then you'll know you lost it fighting for something that mattered, Marcus replied. Your father always said that the moment you compromise your values to chase a contract is the moment you stop being Palmer Industries and become just another manufacturer. Is $60 million worth that? I spent the weekend wrestling with the decision. Called Margaret to get her technical perspective on whether we could maintain quality with overseas production. She was blunt. We could maintain adequate quality, but not Palmer Industries quality. Not the standard that makes aerospace companies trust us with components that keep people alive at 40,000 feet. I called Harold Garrison on Monday morning. My hands were steady as I dialed, my voice clear when he answered. Harold, I've thought about your proposal. And I need to tell you that Palmer Industries won't be moving production overseas. Our workers are the best in the industry, and that expertise is worth the premium you pay for it. If your board can't see the value in that, then perhaps we're not the right partner for you anymore. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprise. You really are Richard's daughter, aren't you? He told me once that integrity was the only competitive advantage that couldn't be copied. I thought he was being sentimental. Maybe he was right. Give me a week to talk to my board. That week felt like a year. I went through the motions of running the company while waiting to hear if I just cost us $60 million and 400 jobs. Employees sensed something was wrong, whispered in break rooms about possible layoffs. I called an all-hands meeting on Thursday to address the rumors directly. I'm not going to lie to you, I said, standing in the main production facility with 3,000 people watching me. We're facing pressure from clients who want us to cut costs by moving jobs overseas. I've refused. Because the moment we do that, we stop being the company your fathers and grandfathers and some of you helped build. We become something else, something cheaper in every sense of the word. But I need you to know that this decision comes with risk. We might lose clients. We might face difficult times. And if we do, I promise you'll know about it honestly, and we'll face it together. The response was mixed. Some people applauded. Others looked worried, calculating how much they had in savings if layoffs came. A man in his 50s, one of our senior machinists named Robert Chun, raised his hand. Miss Palmer, I've worked here 23 years. Your father never lied to us, never asked us to sacrifice while executives got rich. You're doing the same thing, standing up for us when it would be easier not to. Whatever happens, we've got your back. Others nodded agreement. It wasn't unanimous support, but it was enough. Enough to remind me why this fight mattered. Harold Garrison called on Friday afternoon. My board took some convincing, but I made them understand something. In aerospace, you don't get second chances. One failed component and people die. Palmer Industries has never had a catastrophic failure in 40 years. That's worth the premium. We're keeping the contract. I closed my eyes, relief flooding through me so intensely I felt dizzy. Thank you, Harold. You won't regret this. I already don't, he said. And Jessica? Your father would be raising hell right now about how proud he is of you. After I hung up, I sat alone in my office and cried. Not from stress or fear, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility temporarily lifted. 400 families would keep their jobs. The company would survive another quarter. We'd held the line. That spring brought another challenge, this one internal. Frank Castillo, the head of operations who'd tested me in my first weeks, came to my office with a proposal that made my stomach turn. We can increase profit margins by 15% if we switch to a cheaper alloy in our non-critical aerospace components. It meets minimum safety standards, won't affect performance in any measurable way, but it would save us millions annually. I read through his proposal carefully, checking the technical specifications, the cost analysis, the projected savings. Everything he said was accurate. The cheaper alloy did meet minimum standards. It wouldn't cause failures or put anyone at risk. But it also wasn't the best we could do. Frank, I said finally, why did you bring this to me if it's such a good idea? Why not just implement it? He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Because your father would have said no. And I figured you should have the chance to say no too, even though it's a lot of money to leave on the table. I appreciated his honesty. You're right, my father would have said no. And so am I. Not because this alloy is dangerous, but because Palmer Industries doesn't do minimum. We do maximum. We use the best materials, employ the best people, maintain the highest standards. The moment we start cutting corners, even safe corners, we start down a path that ends with us being just another manufacturer. I won't do that. Frank smiled slightly. I was hoping you'd say that. The team has been worried you might be feeling pressure to show bigger profits, prove yourself to the board. This reassures them that you're the real deal. After he left, I sat thinking about how many small compromises it would take to destroy what my father built. How easy it would be to justify each one individually, to say this particular corner was safe to cut, this particular standard unnecessary. Death by 1,000 compromises, each one seeming reasonable until you looked back and couldn't recognize what you'd become. I made a note to include in our next company-wide communication, a reaffirmation of our quality standards. To make sure everyone understood that while I was willing to innovate and adapt, I would never compromise on the fundamentals. Summer brought a different kind of opportunity. A venture capital firm approached me about funding a new division focused on sustainable manufacturing technologies. The pitch was compelling: research into recyclable aerospace materials and carbon-neutral production processes. The kind of forward-thinking innovation my father would have loved. But the VC firm wanted 40% ownership of Palmer Industries in exchange for their investment. They called it a strategic partnership. I called it surrendering control. I brought the proposal to the board, curious to see how they'd react. Theodore Blackwell had resigned after the trial, his reputation destroyed by his association with Derek Stone. The remaining board members were people who'd proven their loyalty to the company's mission. Margaret spoke first. The technology is exciting, but giving up that much ownership? We'd be right back where we started, at risk of being pushed into decisions that prioritize investor returns over company values. James Foster agreed. Your father turned down similar offers a dozen times. He always said that the moment you take on partners who care more about money than mission, you lose the ability to lead with integrity. I'm inclined to agree. We voted to decline the investment, but to allocate our own R&D budget towards sustainable technologies. It would be slower, require more sacrifice, but it would be ours. We'd control the direction, maintain the values, preserve what made Palmer Industries special. That decision led to something unexpected. News of our sustainable manufacturing initiative attracted attention from environmental organizations and socially conscious investors. Within 6 months, we had partnerships with MIT and 3 other engineering schools to research green aerospace technologies. We attracted grants from government agencies interested in supporting American manufacturing innovation. And we started getting inquiries from companies who specifically wanted to work with us because of our ethical reputation. Turns out there was a market for integrity after all. The third anniversary of my father's death arrived on a bright October morning that reminded me of the day we buried him. I drove to the cemetery alone, as had become my tradition, and sat beside his grave for an hour. Told him about the Garrison contract, about turning down the VC investment, about the sustainable manufacturing initiative that was starting to show real promise. Told him about the marriage proposal Marcus had received, how we'd all celebrated together at a dinner that felt like family in the truest sense. Told him that Palmer Industries now employed 3,200 people, had posted record profits while maintaining the highest wages in the industry, and had a reputation as one of the best places to work in Boston. But mostly I told him that I finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me all along. That success wasn't measured in dollars or market share, but in the lives you touched and the principles you refused to compromise. That leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions and surrounding yourself with people who cared about more than just their paychecks. That legacy wasn't what you accumulated but what you left behind when the numbers were forgotten and the buildings were torn down. The values that persisted because they'd been embedded in the foundation of everything you built. A woman approached as I was getting ready to leave, someone I didn't recognize at first. She was in her 60s, well-dressed, carrying flowers. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Jessica Palmer?" I nodded, wondering if this was a reporter or someone looking for money. She smiled. "I'm Helen Foster. James Foster is my husband. I just wanted to tell you something your father did that you might not know about. 25 years ago, my son was diagnosed with leukemia. We had insurance, but it wasn't enough. The treatments were bankrupting us. Your father found out somehow, I never knew how, and he created a medical assistance fund for Palmer Industries employees and their families. He covered everything our insurance didn't. My son survived. He's a doctor now, treating other children with cancer. That happened because your father believed his workers were family and family takes care of each other." She placed her flowers on a nearby grave, her husband's parents, I guessed. "I just thought you should know," she continued, "that the company you're fighting to preserve has already saved lives in ways that won't show up in any profit statement. Keep fighting, Jessica. For all of us." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with tears streaming down my face. I'd known my father was generous, but I hadn't known about the medical fund. Hadn't known how many families like the Fosters had been saved by his quiet compassion. It was exactly the kind of thing he would have done without telling anyone, without expecting recognition or praise. I drove back to Palmer Industries Tower and called an emergency meeting with our HR director. "Tell me about the medical assistance fund my father created." She pulled up the records, showed me that it was still active, still helping families facing medical crises. Over the past 25 years it had assisted more than 300 employees and their families, covering costs that insurance denied or caps exceeded. "We fund it through a percentage of annual profits," she explained. "Your father set it up so it would continue regardless of who ran the company." I increased the funding that day, doubling the percentage allocated to medical assistance. If we were going to honor my father's legacy, we were going to do it completely, in ways that mattered to real people facing real crises. Word of that decision spread through the company faster than any official communication could have. By the end of the week, I was getting stopped in hallways by employees wanting to thank me, to share stories of how the fund had helped them or their families. A machinist whose daughter needed surgery, an accountant whose husband had cancer, a maintenance worker whose grandchild required expensive therapy. Each story was a reminder that business wasn't about spreadsheets and profit margins. It was about human beings trying to build lives, raise families, survive the crises that came for everyone eventually. My father had understood that. Now I did too. The fourth year brought stability, the kind my father would have recognized and approved of. We were profitable but not excessively so, successful but not at anyone else's expense. Our reputation attracted the best engineers, the most skilled craftspeople, the clients who valued quality over cost. We were proof that you could run a business ethically and still thrive, that integrity wasn't a luxury but a foundation for sustainable success. I was 32 years old, CEO of an $800 million company, and finally comfortable in my own skin. Not because I'd proven something to the critics, but because I'd proven something to myself. That I could honor my father's memory not by being him but by being the best version of myself. That I could lead with both strength and compassion, make hard decisions while staying true to core values, face impossible choices and find a way through that didn't require compromising who I was. The board meeting that fall was routine, reviewing quarterly numbers, discussing strategic initiatives, approving budgets. Afterward, Margaret pulled me aside. You know what I realized today? I used to come to these meetings dreading the arguments, the pressure to cut corners, the constant battle between doing what was profitable and doing what was right. Now I look forward to them, because we all know we're building something that matters. That's all I ever wanted, I replied. To make sure my father's work wasn't wasted. You've done more than that, she said. You've shown an entire industry that ethical manufacturing is possible. That treating workers with dignity and refusing to compromise on quality isn't weakness. It's strength. Companies are studying what you've built here, trying to replicate it. You've changed the conversation about what business can be. I didn't know if that was true, but I hoped it was. Hoped that somewhere, other young CEOs were learning that success didn't require sacrificing principles. That profit and purpose could coexist. That the best legacies were built on integrity, one difficult decision at a time. 5 years after my father's death, Palmer Industries was unrecognizable in some ways and exactly the same in others. We'd expanded into new markets, developed innovative technologies, built partnerships that positioned us for the next decade. But we still used the best materials, paid the highest wages, maintained the safety standards that made us famous. Still treated our workers like family, and our reputation like the most valuable asset we possessed. Still made decisions based on what was right rather than what was easy. I stood in front of the memorial statue in the lobby one evening after everyone had gone home, looking up at my father's bronze face. They tried to silence me at your funeral, I said quietly. Tried to erase me from your story. But you gave me the power to write my own ending. To prove that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. To build something worthy of the name Palmer. The building was silent except for the hum of climate control and the distant sound of traffic. I touched the base of the statue, the metal cool under my fingers. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For seeing what I could become even when I couldn't see it. For giving me the chance to honor your memory by living your values. I'll keep fighting, Dad. For as long as I'm here, Palmer Industries will stand for everything you taught me. Integrity over profit. People over numbers. Legacy over wealth. The city lights flickered beyond the windows, Boston settling into another night. And I walked out of the building my father built, the company he'd entrusted to me, secure in the knowledge that his legacy was safe. Not because I was perfect or brilliant or even particularly qualified when I started, but because I understood what he'd spent a lifetime trying to teach me. That some things are worth more than money. That the measure of success is who you become, not what you accumulate. And that the greatest inheritance isn't wealth or power, but the values that guide how you use them. At my father's funeral, they banned me from speaking until the lawyer read words that changed my life forever. But in the 5 years since, I'd found my voice. And I'd used it to tell a story my father would have been proud of. A story about integrity surviving in a world that often values convenience over character. About a daughter honoring her father not by grieving endlessly, but by building fearlessly. About a legacy preserved not in bronze but in the lives touched, the standards maintained, the principles defended even when defending them was hard. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.